You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. Our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. We have a terrific history podcast today. Katja Hoyer, author of Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, is our guest. She's a German-British historian specializing in modern German history. She is a visiting research fellow at King's College London and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Her essays have been featured in History Today, BBC History Extra, and the Washington Post, among other publications. She's being very kind this afternoon on a snowy Indianapolis afternoon to zoom in from Sussex, England, to talk history on the podcast. Ms. Hoyer, thank you very much for appearing today.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's not quite as snowy over here, so it's not as great a hardship as you made it out to be there.
We exchanged some emails. I read your book and talked to your publicist, your publishing house, because I was so taken by your ability in this book to condense what is one of the most impactful and complicated periods in history into just a few hundred pages. And it's eminently both informative and comprehensible. How were you able to do that?
Well, I'm glad it's worked, first of all, because that was kind of the plan. I was intentionally setting out to try and write a book that would be readable by people who have very little knowledge of the period, but hopefully also add a bit of analysis and kind of opinion for those who do know the period well. So I'm glad that balance seems to have worked out. But yes, it's not, I mean, you have to have a great deal of self-discipline, not to go down rabbit holes and individual kind of, niche elements of the topic and just kind of stick to the big strands, but equally try and pull out individual, examples and kind of little stories that just liven up the big one. So it's striking a balance between the two, I think, kind of following the main strand, but then also kind of, bringing in the color and the detail on occasion to try and kind of just exemplify these very complicated and complex matters.
If I had to construct a Mount Rushmore, which is our metaphor for the four most important things, a Mount Rushmore of the top events of the 19th century, along with the defeat of Napoleon and the North's victory in the American Civil War, and perhaps maybe the Bessemer process, the development of the Bessemer process, or maybe Bell's invention of the telephone in 1876. The unification of Germany in the 1860s and 70s is on my list. Does this time period, does this act, this event belong in the top shelf of watershed events, not only of the 19th century, but in all of modern history?
I certainly think so. That's again a reason why I wanted to write this book. It's exactly 150 years ago last year that the German Empire was formed in 1871. And yet there was so little talk about it, and kind of just discussion of it. And as you say, it is a monumental event that just changed everything, really. I mean, before 1871, you haven't got a Germany. It just doesn't exist. And suddenly, almost overnight, basically, the individual German states get merged and form the largest political construct in the whole of Europe. Virtually overnight, you get a state there that is bigger in terms of population, in terms of land size, in terms of its resources, in terms of its potential than anything that's there, and it throws the entire European power balance out of kilter. And the events, that follow later, including both world wars, aren't directly born out of this. So I don't think there's an inevitable path towards that, but it certainly creates a situation where suddenly, Germany has got to fit into this kind of complex network of states, and it doesn't really quite fit in. And that's certainly creating a lot of the problems that, we see the big fallout from later.
You say that it's not an inevitability that those two great cataclysms of the 20th century happen because of Imperial Germany. But is it a fair assertion to say, if you want to understand why they happened, you must understand the creation and the impact of Imperial Germany?
Yes, I agree. I mean, the sort of idea that, you look at 1914 and you try and work out why war breaks out, which a lot of people have been doing. And certainly in terms of German history, people look towards the militarism and the kind of autocratic system that is in place during the war and see that and nothing that came before it. I think that is to misunderstand what happened and to misunderstand one of the key strands that led to this war.
The subtitle of your book is The Rise and Fall of the German Empire. So let me ask you, how did Imperial Germany rise and how did it fall?
You want me to sum this up further even in the book? It's a complex process, really, in terms of the rise even of it. I mean, the idea that there should be a Germany is fairly new. It kind of just emerges out of the Napoleonic Wars. So when Napoleon was defeated, suddenly the German states kind of realized that actually, if they do fight together, they're able to beat even the mighty Napoleon, who kind of terrorized Europe for years beforehand. And that lingers, that kind of sense of nationalism, defensive nationalism, as I call it in the book, this kind of idea of sticking together against somebody else is kind of what creates a sense of kind of national identity or at least the kind of germ of that in German minds. And when the empire is then finally formed in 1871, that's something that needs to be perpetuated. So there's still very little that actually holds Germans together then. They're kind of artificially merged in this kind of blood and iron idea, and hence why I called the book that as well. So this idea that they are together so that they can fight somebody else, and to perpetuate that, you have to kind of artificially keep the idea of conflict alive, and that I think is what eventually eats Germany up again. Certainly, this first incarnation of it, the German Empire, in the First World War, when it's kind of too much blood and iron this time for it to cope with, and then that's what breaks it in the end. So it's kind of come full circle, in my opinion. In 1918, it's war that makes it and shapes it to start with, but it's also war that breaks it in the end.
Is it fair to contend that for centuries, other European countries conspired to keep Germany, the German landmass, perhaps in the center of Europe, a collection of duchies and principalities and free cities and bishoprics and various other geographical definitions? Is that a fair statement? And why would it be in the interest of countries such as perhaps France or Austria to keep the German geographical construct disunited?
I'm not sure that is necessarily the case. I mean, the Germans themselves didn't really have a sense of themselves as Germans. So if you were like from Bavaria, you'd be a Bavarian first and foremost. There wasn't really a sense that you were actually kind of in any shape or form in the same bracket or kind of group as somebody from, say, Hamburg or Berlin. So, you know, that this just didn't exist. Even in 1813, when the Prussian king wants to rally his own troops just within Prussia to try and fight against the French, he still stood there and he doesn't really know how to address these people because they're not really easily put into one category. He can't really say my fellow Germans or even my fellow Prussians without listing them all individually. So he's going, my favorite, you know, my fellow Brandenburgers, my fellow this, that, and the other, because he knows there's nothing in the hearts and minds of these men that is going to be triggered by saying to them, come and follow me, please, fellow Germans, because they wouldn't recognize that category. And that's something that only really emerges in the war, in the Napoleonic Wars. But where you're right is that when the calamity of the First World War happened, the French immediately look at that and say, this happened because Germany became a country. And if we want peace in Europe, we do need to dismantle this construct that is Germany. Otherwise, we will not have peace. So this idea of keeping Germany apart and keeping it separated is certainly there again in 1918, where Poincaré, the French prime minister, says at the outset of the Versailles negotiations in Paris that the kind of wrongs of 1871 need to be righted again, i.e. Germany was wrongly created, caused this calamity. Now let's undo that and let's split Germany up again. So this is certainly an idea that emerges later.
Is it fair to say that the commanders, the generals, or the diplomats feared how strong a united Germany could be militarily and economically, and were those fears justified subsequently?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when Germany is formed in 1871, the first Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, who'd also brought up the unification in the first place and sort of created it, is extremely conscious of the fact that he's just created this massive, kind of quite scary construct in the middle of Europe that's going to frighten Britain, Russia, France. And he sets about immediately to try and convince everyone apart from the French, who he knows they're not going to be convinced because of the kind of historical animosity between the two. But everybody else, he sets about kind of appeasing them, setting Germany up as a peaceful nation, saying to them, look, we haven't got any interest in expansion or even in becoming an empire, as in like a world empire. We're not going to threaten you in any shape or form. What we will do is we'll sit in the center of Europe as the center of gravity and become like the honest broker, kind of negotiating between your problems with each other, whilst we are kind of neutral and you know, have no stake in this. I say the French would never be convinced of that, and Bismarck knows that. I mean, he annexes when he defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 1871 to create Germany out of that war. He annexed some territories, Alsace and Lorraine, from France, which he knew they would never forgive him for. And so France kind of gets isolated in this process, and he realizes that this enmity will stay. So there's no attempt really to try and pacify the French. But certainly within the rest of Europe, he's sort of trying to create Germany as a peaceful nation.
Didn't he say, we have made Germany, now we must make Germans?
Yes, I mean, that's another project of his immediately, kind of, you know, you create this box for people to go in, but now you got to convince them that it's actually nice in the box and they should stay in it, you know, rather than leave again. So it's a bit, actually, I mean, I've compared this to the US before because I think there are similarities there in the sense that people were highly suspicious of like federalism and having a centralized state that tells them what to do. And so, you know, a federalist setup like in the US where you got individual states was the solution to that, to try and sort of create a construct of Germany. But within that, you could still be a Bavarian or a Rhinelander or whatever you know, where you're from, basically.
You mentioned it just a few minutes ago. I was going to ask later, but I'll just insert it now. And that is the post 1871 Bismarckian foreign policy seemed to have been centered on keeping France isolated. He was able to achieve that, Bismarck was. And then after he leaves, 1890, I think, is when he is dropping the pilot, I guess I should say. how important was it to France to find an ally to try to get its revanche against Germany because of the loss of the territories?
It's a tricky one. I mean, they do sort of pay their war debts and the reparations and all that off without, I wouldn't say without moaning, but they certainly do just pay it off and then try and normalize relations with Germany to some extent. But this problem of Alsace and Lorraine, as Bismarck knew at the time, kind of just stealing, annexing those two territories of the French was a ruthless and completely unjustified act in 1871, and that wasn't going to go away. But equally, the German Empire couldn't give them back because it would have, raised a lot of political problems domestically for them because of the nationalism that, kind of had been created. So that was always going to be a thorn, I think, in that particular relationship between Germany and France. And so if France was given half a chance to try and find, somebody else basically to work with against Germany, that was a very real possibility that people were concerned about. So Bismarck called it the nightmare of coalitions, basically this idea that they could potentially work with Russia in particular, to sort of like surround Germany in this nightmare of coalitions so that Germany has got an enemy left and right, east and west of it. They could be fairly certain that Britain wasn't going to be that partner, simply because Britain and France were rivals with their empires in Africa and Asia to a point, certainly in the 19th century, where it was quite unlikely that those two would collude against Germany. And also the royal ties between the German and British royal families were so close that they felt relatively safe there. But yes, certainly in the sense that, there was still French anger and resentment there that never really went away.
Is it true that when people would advocate for Germany to scramble for colonies to create this empire you referenced a few minutes ago, that Bismarck said, we have France on this side and we have Russia on this side. That is my map of Africa.
That's certainly how he saw it. I mean, he always advocated extremely strongly against building an overseas empire, just because it wasn't really worth it to start with. I mean, the world had been carved up between the older European powers, and what was left for a reason, in terms of the resources that were still going to be had, or the difficulties in keeping the respective territories. So one way or another, if you put a foot in there, you are going to have a conflict with the other nations who've already got the lucrative territories. And Bismarck said that's just not worth it. What is the point? And secondly, if, just geographically, if you have like a map of Europe in your mind and you think Germany is largely a landlocked country and where it's got the sea is in the north, if you send German ships out off the north of Germany and they have to get out of Europe, they're sailing through the Channel past the French and the British coastlines, both within actual visibility. And the idea of like somebody stood there in Dover or in Calais and looking out of the window and seeing German warships going in and out, literally into Europe and out of Europe, goes completely contrary to the idea of creating this image of a peaceful Germany. So, that this kind of threat that would have posed in itself, Germany would have needed to build up, as they do later before the First World War, a huge navy to try and police that empire, and then, as I say, sail it in and out of Europe through other people's waters. That was never going to be without conflict, and that's why Bismarck didn't want that to happen.
We are speaking with Katja Hoyer, author of Blood and Iron: The Rise and Fall of the German Empire. We talked geography just a few seconds ago, and you mentioned the nightmare of coalitions. How did Germany's geography, with strong countries like Austria, France, Russia in close proximity, how did that affect its history, sort of its kind of geopolitical philosophy? And was this fear of encirclement justified on Germany's behalf?
Well, Germany's problem is that it hasn't really got natural boundaries to all of its neighbors. And that's always been Prussia's problem as well. So when, you sort of see Prussia as the heart of this new Germany, it's, if you don't know exactly where it is, it's kind of sort of north center of Europe. where there isn't really kind of mountain ranges or big rivers or anything like that that could kind of cut off its boundaries naturally. And that's why, in my opinion, Prussia has already developed this kind of idea of a militia people. So the idea that you're basically arming the civilian population in case there's an incursion and you haven't then got an army big enough to deal with all of your surrounding enemies. And so Prussia had already started this, getting people to basically sign up for regular military training. It goes all the way back to the 18th century. And people would almost kind of be permanently in a military mindset, all of them, not all of them, but the majority of people, basically. And that creates a culture of militarism in a way, that's kind of really ingrained and deeply ingrained into what society was like and into what these people were like. And that then by extension, is true for this newly created Germany as well. So you have, France, as you say, there's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's obviously Italy across the Alps, and there isn't really, and Russia, of course, on the other side, and there isn't really anything that protects this Germany from an invasion. And this constant fear of that becomes almost paranoia in the build up to the First World War, that if they all invaded at the same time, or even, kind of just France and Russia together, Germany would need an army, kind of twice the size, basically, of each of those nations. And that's, almost impossible when you think about the scale and size of Russia alone. And that's something that military circles are constantly thinking and wargaming about. So they're constantly sat there with their pickelhaubers on, in some basement discussing, what they would do if this and that unit gets shifted, to this particular place and that sort of thing. And it just gets them really used to this kind of talk, to the point where it becomes reality in their minds. And by the time that war breaks out in 1914, they're not fazed by it. They talked about it for years, literally, and come up with different plans and contingency strategies. And when it happens, they don't sit there shocked and go, oh, no, war's happening. They go, oh, fair enough. We've been saying for years this was going to happen. And they just, put their plans in place.
Do you think some sort of, because I want to get to the Schlieffen Plan and World War One for sure before the end of the podcast, and we try not to argue for inevitability on history podcasts because really nothing's inevitable except what Mark Twain said, and that is death and taxes. Is it fair to assert that some sort of union, perhaps under Prussian auspices, would have happened in the 19th century, even without Bismarck or the wars, that it was trending that way? Or was it trending to be status quo, antebellum?
There have been, Bismarck couldn't have done that against the grain of history. I'm kind of fairly on the structuralist side in that sense. So, there's this kind of tide of German nationalism that was there. But Bismarck himself said still in 1868, so 3 years before Germany got unified, that he doesn't think it's going to happen in that century. And that I always find is quite remarkable. So he said this in private to a friend, that he doesn't think it's possible, and you're still at this point is 1868, so he's looking at the next, 32 years and saying it's unlikely. And then it just happens 3 years later, and that's due to the specific circumstances that Bismarck created with the unification wars. So it's kind of a mix, really. It was going slowly in that direction, and I think without Bismarck, it still would have happened, but not when it happened and not in the way that it did. It would have taken a lot longer, I think.
So when I was in graduate school, I fell in love with Otto von Bismarck. Is it okay to say that? The both of us. He just seems, we glorify leaders who accomplish great things. And it seems to me what he becomes chancellor in 1862 after receiving, I have this right, after receiving one of the most beautifully worded telegrams of all time from Albrecht von Roon, I think, that says periculum in mora, dépêchez-vous, which means there's danger and delay, hurry up. Beautiful. Who comes up with that kind of stuff these days? Nobody.
Did back in the day.
Yeah, it's beautiful. he becomes chancellor in 1862 because there's a fight between the monarch William I, who comes to the throne after his brother, I think Frederick William IV, dies, but he had been regent because of a instability on behalf of his brother. But William I becomes king. He's fighting with the legislature about the army and who's going to control it and the terms of this army bill. Bismarck, who I think was he in St. Petersburg at this time, or had he gone to St. Petersburg and he was in Paris at this time?
He was in Paris, yeah.
He was in Paris. He comes back. He becomes chancellor. He gives the famous speech, "The great decisions of this day will not be by speeches, but by blood and iron." And he proceeds through three wars, a war with Denmark in 1864, a war with Austria in 1866, and then the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. He creates Imperial Germany and completely changes the trajectory of history. And he has gotten some grief, I'll put it nicely, in the last 100 or so years, 130 years since his passing. 1898, I think, is when he died. And does he deserve his plaudits, his accolades for what he accomplished? But does he also deserve the sort of angry scrutiny for what he created?
Well, I think people conflate two things there, what he created in 1871 and what happened later, long after his death. And he certainly didn't set up, in my opinion, a Germany in 1871 that was going to morph into, what it became basically during the First World War, and absolutely certainly not what it became during the Second World War and then the build up to it. So this kind of very simplistic idea that, Bismarck created Germany, and then a few decades later, out of what he created, came Nazism and the war and the Holocaust and all of the attendant, ideologies that go with that. I don't think that is the case. So he does deserve, I think, some recognition just for the sheer audacity of, what you just described, and just the way that he just did it. Against all of the odds and kind of just got on with it. But I don't think he had a particularly noble kind of motive for doing that. I mean, he wasn't even a nationalist. He didn't believe in a unified Germany for the sake of it. It was all kind of to try and rescue the powers of the aristocracy, to try and make sure that Prussia would retain its kind of trajectory of, power and gaining more power over Austria in particular and the other German states. And so, he's a real politician, the first one, and that's where that word comes from, this kind of idea that morals and nice ideas aren't really what you do politics for. It's doing what is necessary, doing it with the means that are required, regardless of the kind of morality of it. So I'm not sure Bismarck himself would have even engaged into a discussion as to whether it was right or wrong what he did. He would have just argued he did what needed to be done, rather than what was the right thing to do, basically.
But there have been historians. There exists a strain of biographical history that tries to not only Bismarck, but to put Bismarck and Wilhelm II and Hitler all in the same sort of basket. And is it fair to say that you reject that?
Yeah, and that was one of the main reasons also why I wanted to write the book, because I think what Bismarck created in 1871 was at least a half democracy. As I say, not because he wanted it to be, but because he knew that if you don't give the people something, sort of like throw them a bone, basically, that they're going to be even more angry than they were in the 1848 revolutions, which nearly tore the entire system down. And there's also still the specter of the French revolutions, even at that point, obviously they are like in the previous century and a long time ago, but the ideas of liberalism and kind of bringing down the aristocracy really haunted the aristocracy, because people were literally in the 1848 revolutions, like dragged out of their homes, by like lynch mobs and stuff like that. And Bismarck was very concerned about that and tried to save the aristocracy, ironically, by introducing a fair amount of democracy. And so this Germany that he creates, the people forget that half of it, has got universal male suffrage. All men over the age of 25 can vote regardless of their wealth and their status in society, which is incredibly democratic for the time. They hold the budget, entirely in their hands, so they pretty much decide whether the nation goes to war or not. And there is a real parliament, a massive, great big parliament building. The current Reichstag building, the Bundestag was built. This is a statement of intent from the parliamentarians to say they do have a place now in Germany, which they didn't before. So all of that stuff people tend to forget about. This amount of kind of liberalism and democracy that was injected in the system as well. And I wanted to highlight with the book that's worth looking at. That's what failed in 1914. It wasn't inevitable that it would do. The question is, why does that half of Germany abdicate itself over to autocracy and this dictatorship that comes into power during the war? So that, I think, people tend to forget that there's also a strand of continuity there.
And Imperial Germany had, but I think it's fair to say, certainly beyond anything the United States had at the time in the late 19th century, had a significant social services apparatus and safety net for which you wouldn't necessarily associate someone like Bismarck or people who seem to be so militaristic or whatever. That's not something that gets enough attention, but you detail it in your book.
Yeah, and that's kind of linking into what I was just saying about the liberal elements as well. And again, it isn't, Bismarck doesn't introduce things like accident insurance, pensions, those kinds of, social welfare type things. Because he's particularly concerned about the welfare of the workers.
He's just so warm and caring and fuzzy.
Yeah, exactly. On the inside, underneath that picket elbow, there's a caring mind. No, but it's really the sense again, that there's real danger in socialism. I mean, again, this is an element of the 1848 revolutions. Marx had just written the Communist Manifesto that informed a lot of the unrest, that you see in the second half of the 19th century. And there's strikes, mass strikes under Bismarck. The SPD, the Social Democratic Party, is becoming a major player, and they still have a lot of kind of really hardcore socialist and communist elements in them. And Bismarck thinks, right, let's give them a little bit of what they want. Most of the workers aren't genuine Marxists. They haven't read Das Kapital, like front to back. What they want is higher wages, a kind of reasonable life, and better conditions at work. And if we can give them that, he actually called it state socialism, this idea that the state takes over an element of socialism and kind of gives it out to workers in little portions so that it doesn't destroy the entire system. And that might be enough for them to be appeased by that and kind of not strike and not, kind of go out and rebel.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today is author, historian, Katja Hoyer, who wrote Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire. It's an absolutely wonderful book if you want to understand 19th century history and how 19th century history, particularly in Europe, has affected us even in 2022. Read this book. And if you don't believe me, then believe Andrew Roberts, who's one of the leading historians in the world, who wrote that Blood and Iron will undoubtedly become the essential account of this vitally important part of European history. Katja, is it fair to say that Bismarck, who basically created the imperial German government, really wrote a symphony that only he could conduct? That the chancellors who came after him just clearly, for whatever reason, weren't necessarily able to work it like the maestro that Bismarck was?
Because that seems think you would have liked that description.
a lot of what I've read is Bismarck created this government. There's no ministerial responsibility. He's only responsible to the monarch, to the emperor. And it works fine as long as Bismarck's around. But when Bismarck leaves, when he's basically fired, for lack of a better term, by Kaiser Wilhelm II, then it's just not the same. And there's not that restraining influence, that deep thinking, strategic mind that Bismarck brought to the position. Is that a fair accusation or no?
Yeah, I mean, there is that. He's obviously, a political genius, as many people have described it before, just knew exactly, which card to play and when, what tone to strike with whom, that sort of thing. But there's also an element of deliberately engineering a position where you're indispensable. Just take, what you were saying earlier with the parliamentary conflict when he was appointed in 1862. So Parliament don't want military reform. The Prussian king did want it. And Bismarck just steps in there and says, look, we're going to do this, whether you like it or not. Blood and iron is the way forward. And he just does it, and they all sit there and go, you can't just run an illegal budget. And he says, yes, he can. Try and stop me. And then years later has that, kind of retrospectively acknowledged by Parliament that was okay. But in the meantime, just ran an illegal budget, basically. There's absolutely no way that somebody else would have done that, because people just believe in the rule of law and they believe that what you do needs to conform to the rules of society and to what you do in politics. And he didn't. And the same is true for things like foreign policy, for example. So the way that so take Russia and Austria, they're drifting very, very far apart. And Bismarck is keen to stay on good terms with both of them, which is impossible and would have been impossible for anybody else. So what he does is he kind of just makes secret agreements with each of them whilst publicly making certain statements to drive them further apart from each other. And nobody knows that this is happening. So when he resigns, and he previously made the infamous reinsurance treaty with Russia, where they're basically saying they're not attacking each other, that was so secret that the other diplomats didn't know it existed. So when it ran out, Bismarck had resigned and gone, well, it's not my problem anymore, you sort it out. Nobody knew that it was even there, it needed to be extended. And by the time that people realized that, it was too late. Russia took a front with it, and became much more difficult to deal with following Bismarck's departure. So it's also the way that he kept his cards very, very close to his chest and was sort of playing his own game, and thereby made himself completely indispensable. And when he goes, nobody has got any ideas what he's been doing for the last 20 years and how the country was actually run.
I forgive me, but I must say tell very quickly my favorite Bismarck story, and that is when Bismarck, who was a big man, he was like 6'3", 6'4", and he gained a bunch of weight and ballooned as his weight ballooned to close to 300 pounds, 250, 260, which is, even for a man that tall, still a lot of weight. So his family, and I'm telling you a story you already know, but maybe some history nerds who are listening don't know this story. His family intervened and got him a doctor, I think Dr. Swearingen. And he is interviewing Bismarck, the most formidable man in Europe for sure, is interviewing about his health. And when he starts the interview process, Bismarck snaps at him, I don't like to answer questions. And Dr. Swearingen replied, then get a veterinarian. They don't question their patients. Now, how in the hell does someone have the stones to say that to Bismarck and get away with it? And it becomes a part of the Bismarck family. Bismarck loses a bunch of weight and his health gets better and he feels better. How intimidating was Bismarck to other, let's get outside Germany for a second, to other diplomats and leaders throughout Europe? Did he have this aura? And I think the only person who really kind of made him feel like a schoolboy was when he was in the presence of Queen Victoria.
I mean, the thing with Bismarck is that he could be intimidating when he wanted to, but he had all sorts of masks almost to put on and, take off as he pleased. So, people describe, for instance, that he would just burst into tears when he wanted something, especially with the Kaiser, which again, you don't really see, a 6 foot something bloke, do, but he did. He just burst into tears and then, put on this really kind of emotional show about something desperately needed to be done, just to put that emotional weight behind his words. And that's, he could also be absolutely charming and very funny. So a lot of women, for instance, describe that he was a very kind of elegant interlocutor who would kind of joke and, be able to quote from different books at the time and be, kind of just really charming and nice to talk to. So it really depended. And that is one of the things I think that made him so intriguing. But also physically, as you say, is huge, sort of bear of a man, really. Steely blue eyes, blonde hair. So he looked quite formidable as well. When he walked into a room, people would kind of just stop for a moment and look up, quite literally, and be sort of amazed by that as well. His voice apparently wasn't all that impressive, so there's only one voice recording that we've got, but descriptions, people at the time say it was quite sort of reedy and thin. But because of his presence and because of the way that his word choice was always literally on the nose, you would just get exactly the right phrase, exactly the right tone. He mesmerized people. So when he started talking, people would just kind of be silent and listen. And that's, I think, the impact of his person, is the versatility of it.
You can hear the recording that Ms. Hoyer refers to on Wikipedia. They have that recording. They also have a recording, which apparently is the only recording of the voice of someone who was born in the 18th century. And that is the voice of Helmuth von Moltke, who was actually born in 1800. So you can hear his voice as well. Moltke, who was the chief of the Prussian and then Imperial General Staff, really changed warfare in many ways. But yet he's overshadowed perhaps a bit, or more than a bit, by Bismarck. How important was Moltke, his relationship with the king, and the fact that he was a strong enough personality and a competent enough genius in military strategy and logistics? How important was he to what happened in the 1860s and 1870s?
Well, as we said earlier, the unification wars were absolutely crucial in Prussia's ascent to becoming the most powerful of the German states, and then pulling the German states together behind it. So without those wars and without having won them as quickly and as, I don't know, glamorously, for lack of a better word, but basically, they were genuinely perceived by most Germans as kind of like this, glorious event, because they were so quick and relatively pain-free for the German civilians. Without that, it wouldn't have worked. He couldn't have unified Germany. But equally, the kind of new element that he brought in, or one of the many things, as you say, he was kind of a military reformer in terms of strategy, was the kind of just the flexibility in the command chain. So this idea that kind of people lower down could make decisions on the ground without having to refer all the way back up to the command chain to get decisions made. That's quite radical and quite new, and it introduced an amount of flexibility into the Prussian army that was fairly revolutionary at the time. It allowed them to really quickly respond to the situation as they found it, and also put more trust into kind of officers lower down the pecking order. And that really did make a difference, particularly when warfare is beginning to change, of course, in the course of the 19th century, and you don't get this element of kind of movement as much anymore as previously. So, for example, in the Franco-Prussian War, you've got the sort of siege and the bombardment of Paris for a long time, which Bismarck really argues over with Moltke. And it's those kinds of things where Moltke really, does play a huge role, which is why he becomes a bit of a sort of legendary figure. He's one of the sort of founding fathers that Germans perceive as such throughout the early period of the empire.
And Moltke and Bismarck really argue. Like, Moltke's like, the war started, shut up. Go over here and sit in this room. And Bismarck's worry is, with regard to what you just mentioned in Paris, is the longer this goes on, the longer the siege of Paris goes on, the more likely it is that other countries are going to intervene. And then we're in big trouble. This all leads to the proclamation, I think it's January 1871, of Imperial Germany in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, probably the most beautiful room in the world, or certainly in the top 3 or 4. is the proclamation and the creation of Imperial Germany inevitable at that point in Prussian history? Like, they're fighting these wars. Now they've fought the big one. Napoleon the Third famously said, "It is us who have been defeated at Sadawa," which is the famous battle on, I think, July 3rd, 1866, between Austria and Prussia. Was that the goal? Once they get that far into the Franco-Prussian War, it's clear that the Prussians are going to win. Was that Bismarck's design at that point and that of other people? We have a chance here to create something really majestic, which, of course, William I, the King of Prussia, I don't even think actually wanted.
There's still some debate around kind of Wilhelm's particular position. Newer historians have gone down a route and say he was actually more complicit in it than we thought. But the traditional story has it that Wilhelm wasn't overly keen on the idea, and he was certainly retained his Prussian identity as a Prussian king, always more so than adopting his new role as the German emperor. But to answer your other question, is it inevitable at that point? Sort of. I mean, Bismarck's still concerned about it because he doesn't really know what the other kings will do, particularly the King of Bavaria, Ludwig, who's perhaps best known for the beautiful Neuschwanstein castle that all the tourists flock to when they go to Europe. Beautiful, like Disney-like castle. He had a real thing for castles. That was kind of his thing. He just liked being in Bavaria and invest in like culture and building nice, pretty new castles and that sort of thing. And he really didn't want to become like sort of a Prussian sort of servant, kneeling, bending his knee to the Prussians and becoming kind of just a vassal of that within a German state. So he didn't know until the very last minute what Ludwig would do and whether he'd actually signed up to it or not. And it got to a point where Bismarck eventually said, right, he's had enough. He looked at what the problems were for Ludwig, namely he spent far too much money on those lovely castles and was in deep, deep financial trouble. And Bismarck knew that. And so he basically bribed him. He said to him, look, I'm going to write this letter in your name and send it to Wilhelm, offering him the crown and offering him my vassalship, basically, so I'll become part of your empire. Write that on your behalf. You sign it, and in exchange, you get a lot of money, and it solves all of your financial problems, basically, in Bavaria. And that's how he got him to do it. But he didn't know until the very last minute, because Ludwig really didn't want to do this, whether he would accept that or not. So there's still an element, right up until January 1871, where there's some doubt there as to whether this would work, because it did take all of the individual kind of dukes and kings, basically, of the individual states to come together and basically hand the German crown to Wilhelm.
I did a history TV show here in Indianapolis several years ago, and then I brought up the same topic with Professor Susanna Lipscomb, and we were talking about the Tudor period per se, mostly, but I'll bring it up to you as well. And the topic of the TV show was most impactful premature deaths. And, you had William Atheling on the White Ship, who died in the 12th century, and Prince Henry, who was the first son of James I, and whose brother comes to the throne and eventually is executed, Charles I. But in any listing of premature deaths, even though he was 56, I think, at the time, the death of Emperor Frederick III, the son of Wilhelm I and father of the Kaiser, husband to Victoria, who was the daughter of Queen Victoria, his death from throat cancer seems to be almost an endless field to be plowed from a historian's perspective. He reigned for only a few months. If he had lived as long as his father, he still would have been alive in 1914. He would have lived into the 1920s. I think William I lived to be 92 or 91. Remarkable at the time. But how did Frederick's premature death and the ascension of William II to the throne change imperial German and European history?
So how long have we got?
3 hours. I'm not letting you. We're going to talk about this all day and night. I know it's a big question, and forgive me,
Huge,
but
yeah.
it just seems to be that fate intervened in a way that Frederick III was thought to be more liberal, wanted a monarchy on sort of the English constitutional model, perhaps, but changed things. Bismarck was petrified that he would get fired if Frederick and his liberal English wife, as he called her, the English wife, came to the imperial throne. So his death and Wilhelm, I think, who came to the throne, was he 28, 29 when Wilhelm II came to the throne? That really is a turning point. So since you boil down, tens of thousands of imperial German history into just a couple hundred pages, maybe you could take a few minutes and describe how that death changed things.
Well, as you say, the plan would have certainly been for those two to push Germany into a more liberal direction. I mean, not least because, as you say, Victoria was Queen Victoria's oldest daughter, and she had seen her mother with her German husband, Albert, kind of run, England in a very similar way, especially as Albert had sort of come in as the outsider and pushed many of the changes that were happening in England. Vicky thought, so as she, usually referred to herself as Vicky, she had this idea she was going to sort of do the thing in reverse, come into Germany as the English wife, and bring that liberalism in, and then they would, really reform Germany in the same way that had been happening in England. This particularly would have meant scaling down the power of the monarchy. So Victoria at that point in England had far less power already than the emperor still had, or the Kaiser still had in Germany. And so that would have, for instance, been one of the elements there. Frederick himself is so ill that even when he becomes Kaiser, when his father died in 1888, he can't speak. He's already so ill with throat cancer that throughout his very short reign of only 100 days, he can't speak. So there is almost no impact really of his kingship. So it's hard to see really what would have happened had he had more time. What I personally think is that they couldn't have acted completely against the grain of where the court still was and where kind of society in Germany still was. People forget that Germany at this point is a far more conservative country. People haven't really got a huge problem on the whole with the way that the country is run. If you look at the array of political parties on offer, for example, in Imperial Germany, you haven't got a radical communist or socialist party. You haven't got a radical party on the right. They're all kind of there to tweak and reform the system, not to completely get rid of it. And the same is true for the court in an even higher, stance. They would have basically been incredibly protective and defensive about their status. Bismarck had already gone a lot further with his reforms than people were kind of naturally happy with. I think they would have struggled against the situation that they were in to a point where they would have eventually found, I think, that their hands were tied. I think some reforms might have gone through simply because liberalism was obviously a huge thing as well. Many of the Prussian civil servants were quite amenable to that. But I don't think they would have turned Germany into something radically different from what it was.
Kaiser Wilhelm I famously said, it's not easy to be emperor under such a chancellor, referring to Bismarck. But his grandson, Wilhelm II, who we all know from the caricatures and his role in World War I, was determined to go his own way, to be a true leader, a true monarch with power and influence. Tell us a little bit about Wilhelm II, who he was, how he thought. We don't do politics on the Leaders and Legends podcast. We do fun politics. We don't do hateful politics. But I have often said to friends of mine that Donald Trump is more like Kaiser Wilhelm II than any two people I've ever read about in history. So with that as your template, without being political, what was the Kaiser like? Because there were parts of him that were charming and smart, but that just didn't come through.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison that you just made, I try to avoid that in the book as well, but you probably spotted my somewhat veiled attempt to, to not make that comparison. The main thing that makes the two quite similar, and it isn't necessarily a thing about political ideology, it's more about the way that they wanted to be seen, is just an obsession with directly communicating with the people. So this idea that you haven't got kind of boring old, stick up your backside kind of diplomats and mediators between you and the people is something I think that makes him very similar to Donald Trump, in the sense that Trump would kind of go directly on Twitter and put something out, and then all of the staff would kind of frantically run around and try and mediate what he said. And that's exactly what Wilhelm does. So Wilhelm wants to give, for instance, speeches directly to the people, and he's got his little script in front of him, which people have written for him with the speech on it, and he just screws it up and gives a speech as he feels like it on the day. And the Han speech is maybe the most famous example of that, where basically troops were going to go off to China to defeat the Boxer Rebellion there, and he tells them ad hoc, which was not in the speech, behave like the Huns. Basically, it did, like Attila the Hun. Which of course then led to this whole mockery throughout the First World War. This is what your culture looks like, and all of these images of German soldiers, like, torturing babies and all that. And then this kind of nickname of the Hun, of course, stuck. But that's the same thing. And then Wilhelm's chancellor, Bülow, kind of runs away and goes, oh, no, he's actually just said that, because they don't have TV at the time. And the scripts basically of the speeches get published in newspapers so that people can read them. He tries to basically erase that line from what Wilhelm said in the newspapers, and people jeer in Parliament and say, well, where have the Huns gone, when this kind of sanitized speech appears. So it's that kind of thing that really reminded me of it. And he's so obsessed as well with his public image. He'd sit there, over breakfast and read the newspapers and just scanning the whole thing for words about him and what people have said about his appearance the other day, when he spoke somewhere, or when he appeared somewhere to visit a factory or something. And he would just obsess over the words that the journalists used to describe him, that kind of thing. And that's basically what reminded me a little bit. It's not so much the politics per se, but more the obsession with public image.
As someone who does public relations for a living and writes speeches for a living, your description of the angst of the government officials is well taken. But the Kaiser was, in some ways, charming, certainly. He had a phenomenal memory, as I recall. But he was ridiculously impulsive and very sort of braggy, nationalistic. He had a deformed arm. It was a breech delivery, and they had to extract him with forceps, and that thing had damaged the nerves in one of his arms. So historians have speculated, like, what did that mean for his personality, so on and so forth. He seemed to be alternately very enamored and very jealous of his English cousins, which may be some of the impulse for the Navy. But he had one particularly bad relationship. First off, he had bad relationships with all the monarchs of Europe. Tsar Alexander III wrote nasty things about him, which Bismarck showed him at one point, said he was a badly brought up man with poor manners or something like that. He also didn't get along, and this perhaps is more important, did not get along with his uncle, who was Queen Victoria's son, and that's Edward VII. How did Wilhelm's behavior personally affect Germany's destiny?
As you say, this obsession with, or kind of love-hate relationship in particular with England, I think there's something to that. I wouldn't want to go down the whole like Freudian thing, as some historians have done, and trace everything back to his childhood maladies and his arm and all the rest of it, and also his relationship to his mother, which was fraught because of the way that she tried to fix him, basically. So she thought that this disabled arm, basically, or this arm that he couldn't use, was a failure of hers as a mother, and also one that couldn't be tolerated in a monarch. And so call it a villain when he was little. They tried things like cutting a tendon in his neck, to try and put his neck back straight, which had sort of slanted to one side because of the arm not fully developing, that kind of thing. And Willem didn't take that particularly well, because he was constantly told that there was something wrong with him by his mother. And I think to some extent there's something to that made his relationship with England per se fraught. But he did love his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and spent a lot of time with her at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, where you would have seen the Royal Navy go in and out of the Solent. That's kind of right in front of Portsmouth and Southampton. So both the kind of merchant navy as well as the actual navy kind of go in and out there, and that would have impressed him. He was highly impressed by the scale and size and kind of glamour of the British Navy, and wanted that for himself. And equally, he had to constantly rival Britain and sort of beat it, at its own game, basically. So he sponsored his own naval cup, for example, the Emperor's Cup, right, and that kind of thing, which made him enjoy his boat racing and all that sort of thing as well. So there is an element there of both kind of being a rival but also admiring England at the same time, and that's, I think, comes out during the First World War as well.
We have a few minutes left with Katja Hoyer, author of Blood and Iron: The Rise and Fall of the German Empire. It's a terrific book. It's received wonderful reviews, and if you want a concise yet fun and really engaging history of this time period, please pick it up. World War I. It happens because of it happens for a million reasons, but the tiny proximate reason is because one of the worst wrong turns in history that led the Archduke right in front of Gavrilo Princip, his eventual assassin, who was sitting there crying in his beer because he didn't have the stones to kill him before with the bomb. We don't have time to go into that. It's an amazing set of coincidences powered by fear and military timetables. There's so many terrific books on the outbreak of World War I, whether it's The Guns of August. I like The Sleepwalkers. That's probably my favorite one. That's really good. But is there anything about World War I, its timing or its outbreak, that you find inevitable? Like, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when, because that was in the mindset of so many generals and politicians at the time.
I think some form of conflict probably was. I mean, there's Bismarck sat there in the 1880s and saying, one day a great war is going to come out of some foolish thing in the Balkans. It was that obvious for everyone to see, that even back in the 1880s, some form of conflict would arise. I think where an element of all of these coincidences do lead to the calamity is the scale of it. So the way that this kind of relatively localized conflict between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, effectively, triggered by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, then leads to the alliances and then the militarism and all of the other factors to kind of pile on top and create out of this relatively localized conflict, the biggest human conflict that the world had seen to that point, perhaps rivaled obviously by the American Civil War, but certainly on a par with that. That's, I think, the tragedy of it is that chain of event that's triggered by it. But I think some form of conflict was certainly on the cards. I mean, you see this with the Crimean War in the 19th century as well. The fact that both the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were beginning to break apart meant that stuff had to be reshuffled and refigured in Europe on a scale even bigger than the unification of Germany, I think. And that was always going to lead to tensions between the other players in Europe who wanted a part of that cake that was falling apart. And I think that is pretty much that tension was going to escalate somewhere, was inevitable, also with the way that everyone was just armed to the teeth. And wars hadn't happened before on that scale within people's lifetimes. I mean, when you think from a German perspective, the last war was in 1871 or finished in 1871 with relatively small scale casualties, all done within a matter of months. That's what people thought of when they thought war. It wasn't a thing to be avoided. It was a means of politics, and a legitimate one as that. People didn't see it as morally wrong either. So I think with all of those factors in mind, some conflict was inevitable, if not perhaps exactly in the form that it happened.
Always found the relationship, the mutual sort of fear between Imperial Germany and Tsarist Russia as the real driver of European relations in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th. Is it fair to say there was a mutual fear that, and I think, didn't Moltke advocate for a preventive war against Russia at some point in the 1870s or 1880s, that Russia is getting so big that eventually we just won't be able to handle them. There's just too many troops, too many guns, a mindset of sacrifice that we're going to have to fight them eventually. So let's fight them now before they get too strong.
I mean, people's thinking was very much shaped and colored by the Industrial Revolution that had taken place in Europe. So people were looking at their own countries, particularly Germany, which saw another second Industrial Revolution in the sort of 1870s and 1880s. And we're thinking, well, if the Russians do the same thing, with their country and the scale and size of it and the amount of resources that they've got, then we don't stand a chance. And that's what they're worried about. So looking at, because it seemed inevitable that this would happen to Russia eventually, when you look at how it started in Britain, then what happened to the US, where it took longer, but it was bigger, but it happened at the same time. Same in France, same in Germany. And this kind of idea that if Russia manages to get itself into this kind of state and moves away from an agrarian society towards an industrialized one, then Europe is in a very, very precarious position. And that's what they're worried about. And that's what they're talking about. The Kaiser, on the other hand, with this kind of inherent arrogance, listens to all of this talk and sits there and goes, if anybody else tells me something about the Russian steamroller, they need to leave the room, and got very arrogant and complacent about that, and basically said there's nothing to worry about, it's only Russians. What are we talking about?
Which is very, very racial in its foundation, the Slavs versus the Aryans. And
that's right. He does list a lot of people in that list of rants as well. It's not just Slavs and Russians, but he's talking about, I don't know what he lists there, like, all sorts of unpalatable terms we wouldn't use anymore, but basically people that he considered sort of racially and morally, and also in terms of their willpower, inferior to Germans. So that's very much on his mind, and why this talk of the militaries, of kind of, warning of Russia, kind of almost turns into its opposite with him. He sort of goes, well, let's see, shall we? And kind of just gets into a mindset where he isn't worried about them.
The Kaiser Wilhelm II and Imperial Germany get assigned by far, including in the actual Versailles Treaty, the share of war guilt, the blame for the start of World War I. I always kind of felt like the Russians got off the hook a little bit, but I defer to your expertise. Did Germany get the proper amount of guilt for the Great War, or has scholarship changed?
I think a lot of that came out of the scholarship that happened after the Second World War. And there wasn't an obvious need to try and draw a link between the two. So people like Fritz Fischer famously, sought to find a link there between why is a large scale war like that twice emanated from German soil. There must be a reason. And so different explanations were found to try and link the two together. And nobody at this point sort of sat there and said, well, hang on a minute, perhaps the Second World War, happened at least in part out of a kind of the consequences of the First World War. It was seen as either, this whole Sonderweg thing, there's something inherently wrong in the way that Germany has come about and developed. There have been people like Goldhagen is perhaps the most famous example of kind of more of a kind of psychological, almost racial dimension to that. So there's something inherently wrong with the Germans themselves that created those. So these are very sort of post-war ideas, that Germany must be to blame for both of them, because it's definitely to blame for the second. And if you trace back from there, you basically end up with this explanation. In my personal opinion, I do think I wouldn't go quite as far as the Sleepwalkers, as Christopher Clark has, in terms of, Germany kind of unknowingly and unwittingly walked into this, because there's a lot of evidence that, there was a desire for sort of people like Moltke, the younger in this case, his nephew, the nephew of the elder that we were talking about earlier, to sort of prove himself, prove Germany's worth as a nation. And also a certain recklessness that I was referring to earlier, this idea that people just didn't know what the scale of this whole thing was going to be.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Just about it had been 40 years. It was pretty short wars. Hell, the Austro-Prussian War was a few weeks, and they had no idea what was coming. But Germany, Imperial Germany, as seeming the driver of the war, whether it's the blank check to Austria or the implementation of the Schlieffen Plan by violating neutral Belgium, seems to have set themselves up to receive that guilt, to receive the lion's share of the guilt. And I think, to your point, wasn't it in the treaties that ended World War II that, like, wasn't Prussia abolished? Like, just abolished?
Yeah, and that's part of this as well. So they were all pretty much in unison, including actually many people in Germany, like Konrad Adenauer, for example, who would later become the first West German chancellor, who blamed Prussia for all of that and saw Prussia as the linking element. As I was just saying, they were looking for explanations why all of this happened. And Prussia seemed a good culprit for that as well, because that, was seen as the element that brought the militarism and this kind of war culture and then the excessive sort of masculinity of Germany into this entire thing. And the idea was, you exercise almost Prussia from this kind of Germany, and you get a purer, better country that's sort of, devoid of this kind of evil spirit that's at the heart of it, which I think is nonsense, to be honest. As I said before, there's a liberal tradition in Prussian history as well. But the thing in terms of like the guilt question, there's no doubt in my mind that people were at the very least accepting of the possibility of war and didn't mind it coming. And therefore the policies are very much driven in that direction. That's certainly, I think, Wilhelm's stance is kind of, well, if it's going to happen, bring it on and do it now rather than in 10 years. And that seems to me was the attitude in 1914.
Which was quite candidly President Abraham Lincoln's thought about the American Civil War. He famously said, well, if the tug has to come, let it come now. So it's going to happen. Let's get it over with. Just a couple more questions before we get to the 5 questions. The fact that for basically 4 years, Imperial Germany held off Great Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia. Does that both give you an idea of how strong Imperial Germany was and perhaps legitimize the fears that other countries had about it, that it was this powerful? It was a colossus.
Yeah, it was, but in many ways before the war, certainly, a lot of the countries around it, particularly Britain and Russia, didn't have a problem as such with it. As long as it wasn't going to get in their way, there wasn't really a desire to start with, to destroy it immediately again. And so Germany was given a huge amount of time to just build itself up, in terms of its economy and its industry. So by 1914, Germany has overtaken Britain in many ways,
right.
Steel production and that kind of thing. It had the second largest navy in the world at that point as well. So it's just, just had these decades before the First World War where people, apart from the French, kind of assumed that it was a peaceful nation. It had a fair point about needing to defend itself. The military buildup was very much in the spirit and the zeitgeist basically of the time, because everyone else was doing it as well. None of this was seen as particularly German or particularly threatening in that sense. And people had kind of come to see that, yes, Germany was building up a tiny little empire, but that was never going to threaten the French and the French and the British one. So I don't think until the war broke out, it was seen as a thing that needed to be destroyed. But by the time that it does break out, it's amassed a huge amount of resources that some historians estimate were roughly equal to the other European powers when collectively together. Other historians have even argued it was only the entry of the US in 1917 that tipped the balance over in terms of the war of attrition, basically, and the amount of resources that needed to be flung into the war. But that just goes to show what a economic colossus Germany had become by 1914.
Ludendorff famously said, after the United States entered the war, we cannot fight the whole world.
Yeah, they should have thought of that in 1914, shouldn't they?
Can you think of another dynasty in history that made such an impact on world history, world affairs, as the Hohenzollerns did in that 40-some year period between 1871 and 1918 when the Kaiser has to abdicate?
Well, I think we're a bit sort of colored by our recent history, aren't we, in that sense, because we're kind of just looking at the events that came shortly before us. But then when you look at, the hundreds of years of the Romanovs, for example,
Mm-hmm.
And collate these things together and the amount of power that they wielded in Russia until they were so brutally disposed, I would say, collectively, that's quite a big influence of what's happening in Europe as well. Or take somebody like, Henry VIII and his church reforms just in one go, sort of creating a sort of Protestantism in England that was then projected out onto the world, particularly America, of course, which is also, a lasting impact to today. And that's just down to the fact, that you wanted an heir basically and needed to get rid of the Catholic Church for that reason in England. So, it's kind of little things sometimes like that and how you measure the impact of it.
Last question before we get to the 5 questions. I always thought it was kind of an interesting, not a coincidence perhaps, but maybe a happenstance of history that Empress Eugenie, who was married to Napoleon III, who pushed hard for France to whack Prussia in 1871, and she ended up losing, and they fled to England, that she lived long enough to see France avenged. She died in 1920. Conversely, Wilhelm II, who fled to the Netherlands in exile, lived long enough, he lived to 1941, to see Germany avenged. What do you think was going through their minds as these historical turnabouts were happening?
Well, in the case of Wilhelm, I can give you a definite answer because he congratulated Hitler on the invasion of France and sort of saw it as a sort of fair retribution, which is quite interesting, really, because this debate at the moment is going on in Germany because the current Prince of Prussia, as he still styles himself, wants a lot of his property back and is fighting a legal battle to get that back, which was confiscated after the Second World War. And to do that, there's a law in Germany. You've got to prove that your family didn't help let the Nazis into power. So there's a huge debate at the moment around the Hohenzollerns and their relationship to the Nazis.
And one of the things, just very quickly, you wrote the article. Where can the Leaders and Legends audience find this article? Because I just read it last night. Oh, did you?
The Spectator. I wrote it for the Spectator. So if you Google something like Wilhelm, my name, and the Spectator, you it probably comes up. But yeah, so that's in terms of Wilhelm II's relationship to the Nazis, he was quite critical from the off. He had a very, very kind of low opinion of Hitler. He just saw him as there's a lot of social arrogance involved in it as well. He was just like this jumped up Austrian, basically, he was Prussian nobility and all the rest of that. He was also mortally embarrassed and shocked by the Nuremberg laws that sort of outlawed Jewish citizenship and introduced all of these race laws. But then when Hitler invaded France, he just couldn't help himself, but sit there and sort of cheer and say this is the reverse of what I, kind of failed to do, and congratulated Hitler. And that's something that really tore the legacy of the Hohenzollerns down quite a bit in kind of history, because that's the thing that people tend to focus on.
We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Ms. Hoyer, are you ready?
Yeah, I hope so.
What was your first job?
It's a bit geeky. I worked as a IT technician kind of thing. So I was building computers and repairing them for people, like back in the day when they still had Windows 98 and would come up with blue screens and stuff. So I'd go around old people's houses and fix their computers for them.
In which town? Which country?
Back in Germany still.
What was your first concert?
I don't know if that means anything to people. It was Wolfgang Petri, who's a German pop singer, really cheesy. Maybe I should tell you about my first English one, which in England, which I really enjoyed. That was Brian Wilson. Came over to do his Pet Sounds tour in 2016, and I just thought he's a living piece of music history. How is he sat there singing this? This was the anniversary tour of Pet Sounds, and I was absolutely mesmerized by him sitting on the stage and singing it.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you choose?
This is not a history one because I thought that'd be a bit lame. I really enjoyed The Soul of an Octopus by Simon Montgomery, which completely changed my mind about perception and how you see the world. It's basically how octopuses see the world and perceive it with their 74 different brain lobes, and how they can smell with their skin and stuff like that. Is really interesting because it just changes the way that you see the world. Thinking if I was an octopus, the world would be an entirely different place.
Now, this question is somewhat unfair to historians, but in reading an interview with you in which you were given a bunch of questions, you gave kind of the answer to this. Let me see if it's the same one. You were given, I think it might have been BBC History or History Now. They asked a bunch of questions that are kind of like these, and you gave answers. And I saw that you've kind of answered this. So let me see. If you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
Did I say about the Prussian Queen, Louise, and her meeting with Napoleon? Yeah, that is definitely a contender because she was supposed to have negotiated with Napoleon at Tilsit.
Right.
And there are various different, Napoleon always slagged her off afterwards and said, she was trying to seduce him and he wouldn't. And, basically tried to play this meeting down, but equally he said before she was the only man in Prussia.
That's
he actually took her seriously, and she actually she did have balls. I mean, she was one of the kind of, I would say, founding mothers of both Prussian and kind of German history in many ways. So I'm always intrigued what actually happened in that tent. But what I was going to say to you is my second favorite, I'd say, is the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. It was the largest battle before the outbreak of the First World War. And I just think that's as close as you're going to get to something like Lord of the Rings style. It's huge. But at the same time, it hasn't got machine guns and, modern kind of weaponry that you'd associate with the First World War. So you've got horses and drums and, people blowing horns to communicate with their armies and that sort of stuff. So I'd love to have seen that.
That's a terrific answer. Absolutely right. Last one. You wouldn't want to see Bismarck's interview with Queen Victoria?
Maybe, yeah, actually meeting. But if you'd asked the last question about meeting somebody, about a person in the past, Bismarck would definitely have been my choice.
If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose?
The Queen. Just because she's supposed to be incredibly funny, in sort of private, and also because she's met people from Winston Churchill, to now. She must have just gathered so many things. I'm not sure 2 hours would be enough, but what she's sort of seen and heard and witnessed in her life, she must be a fascinating person to talk to.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Katja Hoyer, author of Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire. It's a marvelous book. It's been described as brisk, thoughtful, and thoroughly engaging. And it's definitely all three of those. Plus, you as a guest on the podcast have been wonderful. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.